Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, to the bustling sun-drenched streets of ancient Babylon, where the air smells faintly of baked clay, fresh dung, and roasted grain. You're standing barefoot in the middle of a narrow alleyway, dust clinging to your toes as you squint at a low mud brick building with a wooden sign dangling from a string of goat hair. You don't speak Akkadian, not really, but the symbol etched into the hanging sign is pretty clear. This is a place where you rent goats. Yes, rent goats, not buy them, not barter for them, rent them, like a bicycle or a moving truck. Except this one chews your neighbor's garden. The clatter of hooves echoes around the corner as a herd trundles past, their bells jingling like sleepy wind chimes. Somewhere, a temple gong sounds. Someone shouts about barley prices, and over it all rises the soft, bored bleating of goats, the true soundtrack of this Mesopotamian metropolis. You're about to find out how this unlikely scene, half-petting zoo, half-paperwork disaster, gave birth to one of humanity's weirdest and most enduring inventions, the humble receipt. Not for groceries, not even for taxes, but for goats. And you probably won't survive this without misplacing at least one animal. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is. Drop that in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step further into the city, Babylon, around 1800 BCE. Dust swirls in the heat, and you can just make out the ziggurat in the distance, towering like a giant staircase to the heavens. Behind you, someone loudly haggles over the price of onions. In front of you, a man is crouched in front of a low stone bench, gently etching wedge-shaped marks into a small tablet of clay. He's not drawing, he's recording. Because here, every goat rented must be accounted for. The thing about Babylon was that it didn't run on money, not like we think of money today. Silver pieces existed, sure, but the real economy was built on stuff, goods, services, and quite often, livestock, especially goats. Goats in Babylon were multi-purpose miracles. They gave milk, they were easy to transport, they grazed through scrubby land that nothing else would touch, and they fertilized the ground as they walked. A little stinky? Yes, but economically essential, and that's where you come in. You're just another person in the city. Maybe you've got a patch of barley growing out back and a cousin who owes you a favor. But you don't own a goat, yet you need one. Maybe to mow the patch of grass before your in-laws arrive. Maybe to lend as payment for temple dues. Maybe you just think goats are cool, which is fair. In Babylon, renting one is as easy as asking at the scribal bench. Well, easy is relative. You crouch down beside the scribe. His fingers are stained with clay and dust, his stylus worn to a stub. He doesn't look up. Instead, he mutters, "Name?" in a voice that could bore a statue to sleep. You give a name. It's long and beautiful and very Babylonian, something like Enlil Nasir or maybe Zuzu, depending on how playful you're feeling tonight. He nods, then, "Goat condition?" You pause. You don't have the goat yet, obviously. That's the point. But he wants to know how you expect it to be returned. "Alive," you say with an awkward laugh. The scribe doesn't smile. He writes, "Mulu ash shasheeni shala shakanu," something about a standard goat, uninjured, unblemished, no broken hooves. There's something oddly formal about it all. But that's the Babylonian way. You're not just borrowing a goat. You're entering a legally binding agreement, sealed in clay. It will be baked. It will be archived. It might outlive you. Now, if you were in a hurry, you'd just sign with a thumbprint and be off. But you linger, watching as the tablet slowly fills with lines of cuneiform. It's oddly soothing, little triangles pressed into damp clay, like sleepy punctuation marks from another world. This, historians say, is one of the earliest known uses of writing, to track livestock transactions. Not epic poems, not battle records, goats. And the scribes, they were like living spreadsheets, walking Excel docs and linen skirts. They could record every goat lent, borrowed, sold, lost, or mysteriously eaten by a lion. Every name, every due date, every penalty for late return. Because, oh yes, late returns were a thing, so were damages. If your borrowed goat got sick or wandered into someone's barley patch and caused mayhem, guess what? You were liable. Babylonian goat rental laws didn't mess around. Historians still argue whether these transactions were purely economic or had ritual significance. Some goat rentals were temple-based, after all, and might have involved tithes or sacred duties. But one thing's certain, these ancient receipts weren't just bureaucratic clutter. They were essential, and they were oddly beautiful. Some were tiny, no bigger than a modern phone screen. Others were massive, built to last, and stored in temple archives. Occasionally, a receipt would be rolled into a clay envelope. Yes, a clay envelope, and sealed with a cylinder stamp, just like an ancient goat rental wax seal. You stroll away from the scribal bench, receipt in hand. It's warm from the sun, slightly curved and etched with symbols that you technically can't read. But you trust it. This little tablet is your proof. Your goat is reserved. You can collect it from the merchant pen near the southern wall. On the way, you pass a woman trading herbs for textiles, two boys arguing over who owns a rooster, and a group of traveling musicians performing a hymn to Ishtar that sounds like a lullaby with hiccups. The city is alive, dense, dusty, chaotic, but it functions somehow, thanks in part to these little clay promises. You wonder if someone, thousands of years from now, will dig up your receipt and try to guess why you needed that goat. Will they picture a solemn ritual, a sacrificial rite, a festival? You smirk. In reality, you just wanted your courtyard cleaned the lazy way. The goat rental pen smells goatish. A young boy, no older than 10, watches over the animals. He has a stick and an expression of eternal boredom. You show your receipt. He squints, shrugs, and hands you the rope of your temporary companion. It's a small, wiry goat, brown. One ear flops. She looks at you like she's already judging your life choices. Congratulations, you've officially rented a goat in Babylon. Now all you have to do is return it, alive, unblemished, and on time. Oh, and you'll need another receipt when you give it back. Goats, the original side hustle. So here you are, goat in tow, receipt tucked into the fold of your sash, trying not to trip as your new four-legged rental companion decides to stop and snack on a stranger's doorstep mat made of reeds. You tug gently. The goat glares. Apparently, she has opinions about being on a leash. You might think this is just an odd errand in an even odder city, but actually, what you're doing is part of one of the most common economic activities in Babylon, making use of animals as portable income. Goats weren't just adorable, bleeding fertilizer dispensers. They were part of a larger system of side hustles that kept ordinary Babylonians afloat. You see, most people here weren't kings or priests or scribes. They were laborers, brewers, farmers, and merchants, scraping by in a world where droughts, floods, and overly curious gods could ruin your season in a blink. So what did people do to make ends meet? They turned to their livestock, especially their goats. If you were lucky enough to own a few goats, you didn't just milk them or shear them or stare lovingly into their strange rectangular pupils. No, you rented them out to neighbors, to travelers, to the temple, to that guy 2 streets over who was always suspiciously short on animals but long on excuses. Goat rental was income. It was security. It was your backup plan when the barley harvest underwhelmed or your cousin's date wine business flopped again. Now, renting out a goat wasn't just here, take her, and bring her back eventually. Oh no, this was Babylon. And Babylonians were deeply into contracts. You had to agree on how long the goat would be used, whether she'd be milked, what she'd eat, and most importantly, how healthy she had to be upon return. One wrong move and you could be liable for damages. You return a goat with a limp. That's a deduction. If she comes back pregnant when she wasn't when she left, weirdly, also a problem, unless it's the right kind of goat pregnancy, and even then, good luck explaining it to the scribes. Historians still argue whether these agreements were mostly informal among neighbors, or if they passed through scribal bureaucracy every single time. The answer? Probably both. For casual deals, neighbors may have had verbal understandings, but for temple-related transactions or anything tied to taxes, rent, or agricultural planning, those receipts were mandatory. And speaking of temples, they weren't just spiritual hubs, they were massive economic powerhouses. The Temple of Marduk, for example, owned huge herds of animals, including, you guessed it, goats. These temples would rent out their livestock to community members, who, in turn, owed a cut of any profit back to the temple. A sort of divine franchising system, if you will. Goat loans weren't limited to food or field work either. Sometimes goats were lent out for breeding. A particularly sturdy, good-natured goat, the golden retriever of the herd, might be hired to improve someone's herd genetics. Other times, they were used to fulfill a religious vow. Maybe someone promised to lend a goat to the temple every spring to honor the fertility goddess, and, let's face it, hedge their bet against a bad planting season. You walk your goat through a narrow alley where laundry flaps overhead like sleepy prayer flags. A merchant on the corner calls out, "Need another one? This one looks judgmental." Your goat snorts at him as if confirming the insult. You smile politely and keep walking. Now, let's talk economics for a second. Babylon didn't use coins the way we think of them. There was silver, yes, but it was mostly measured out in weight, shekels, and used in large-scale transactions. For the average person, trade and barter ruled the day. And goats? They were versatile currency. A healthy adult goat could be traded for a small sack of barley, a jug of date wine, or a few days of labor. But here's the thing. A rented goat lets you earn all those things without giving the goat away forever. You kept your asset. You just temporarily shared the benefits, like Airbnb, but for livestock. So what did people do with their rented goats? Plenty. Some people used them to clear overgrown land, letting the goats munch through tangled weeds like slow, fuzzy machetes. Others milked them to make cheese, yogurt, or just to sell the milk outright. Still others bred them, especially if the goat came from a respected line, which, yes, existed. Think goat aristocracy. There are even records of goats being used to pay other debts, as in, I owe the priest 2 goats, but I don't have 2 goats, so I'll rent a goat, use it to pay my temple tithe, and figure out how to get it back before the rental's due. Babylonian logic was many things, but never boring. You pass a courtyard where 3 women are debating loudly about whether their neighbor's goat trampled their cucumber bed on purpose. One is holding a clay tablet. The other two are brandishing leafy stalks. The goat in question watches from the shadows, looking entirely unbothered. Quirky? Yes, but also incredibly organized. Babylonian society ran on trust, yes, but that trust was written down. The receipts weren't just practical, they were proof. They were security. They allowed people to keep a record of what was promised, what was exchanged, and what was still owed. And if someone tried to deny a deal, boom, you had your clay tablet. Show it to the scribe, the priest, or the city judge, and they'd read it aloud like a grocery list of justice. One famous tablet from the city of Sippar records a transaction where a man rents a she-goat for 4 months, with conditions about feeding, milking, and returning the animal in good condition. 4 months. That's a long time to keep track of a goat. But thanks to the receipt, nobody had to rely on memory. There's even a record of a woman, yes, women could own and rent goats too, who loaned out 3 animals and carefully tracked their return with individual tablets. Her archive, found in her home centuries later, still neatly stored in a clay jar. Historians still debate whether this level of detail was common or elite behavior. Some argue that temple scribes made this practice widespread, while others believe only wealthier families could afford such administrative flair. Either way, it shows how deeply integrated goat-based contracts were in everyday life. As your own goat leads you into a patch of shade and plops down like she's decided the walk is over, you realize something else. This system worked because people believed in it. The clay receipt wasn't just a record. It was a promise, a symbol, a piece of shared culture. You sit down beside your goat, the tablet warm in your hand. A breeze kicks up, carrying the scent of crushed herbs and sun-baked brick. The streets hum around you, low and drowsy like a lullaby made of footsteps and soft voices. Goat rental wasn't just a side hustle in Babylon. It was a lifeline, a ritual, a surprisingly bureaucratic form of neighborly cooperation wrapped in dust, milk, and cuneiform. You lean back, the goat sighs, and you both stare up at the pale blue sky of a world that somehow managed to run on the backs of small, stubborn animals and tiny clay contracts. The scribes who invented the paper trail. You're back on your feet now, the goat somewhat cooperative, tablet safely tucked into your sash, as you weave through the city's market quarter, where even the onions are yelling at each other. It's time we pause to appreciate the real heroes behind your humble goat receipt, the scribes. Picture a man, hair oiled, robe just slightly ink-stained, and fingers permanently dusted with clay grit, bent over a small desk in the corner of a busy temple or merchant house. He's not praying. He's not making potions. He's doing admin work. And it is glorious. In ancient Babylon, the scribe wasn't just a glorified secretary. He was a rock star of record-keeping, a bureaucratic wizard, the trusted middleman in a society obsessed with certainty. And if you wanted your goat rental to be official, you needed one of these stylus-wielding champions on your side. Babylonian scribes didn't write with pens or quills. They used a stylus made of reed, pressing wedge-shaped impressions into soft clay tablets. This script, called cuneiform, looks like the world's oldest attempt at angry texting. But it worked. Each little wedge carried meaning, names, numbers, verbs, even tone, and all of it was baked into clay that could last thousands of years, unless your goat stepped on it. Now you might be wondering, why all the fuss? Couldn't people just shake hands? Well, no. Babylon was a city of over 200,000 people at its peak. Traders, farmers, temple workers, foreigners, and more. You couldn't rely on memory and goodwill alone. What if someone rented your goat, promised to return her by the next full moon, and then suddenly claimed, What goat? Never met her. That's where the scribes came in. Their job was to make transactions real. When you went to rent out your goat, you'd march over to the local scribe's booth, usually near the temple or marketplace, and dictate the terms. Who was lending the goat? Who was renting it? How long? Whether the goat was for milking, breeding, or lawn mowing purposes, if the goat had any health conditions, whether she liked being scratched behind the ears. Okay, maybe not the last one, but you get the idea. The scribe would then carve the agreement into wet clay, often in duplicate, one for the lender, one for the renter, and sometimes a third for the temple archives. You might also impress a personal seal, a tiny cylinder rolled across the clay, leaving behind a unique stamp that served as your signature. Some were decorated with lions, gods, or carefully carved animals. Others just had your name in cuneiform, branding. Historians still argue whether these scribes always worked independently or under temple supervision. Some believe that most scribes were temple trained, working within a network of official bureaucracy. Others think that freelance scribes roamed the markets, taking on jobs from merchants and common folk alike. Either way, they were indispensable. Because here's the wild thing. Babylon had no separate legal class, no lawyers, no notaries. The scribes were the legal system. Their tablets were admissible in court. If a dispute arose, say your goat came back missing an ear, you took the tablet to the city judge and he would read it aloud and issue a verdict. No receipts, no justice. It was that simple. You walk past a temple school now, young boys crouched over tablets, grumbling as their teacher barks at them to rewrite the same line of cuneiform 10 more times. It's the ancient equivalent of detention. Learning to be a scribe took years. First, you memorized symbols. There were over 600 of them. Then you practiced writing by copying famous texts, proverbs, and contracts. Eventually, you moved on to real-world tasks, goat loans, land leases, marriage agreements, beer sales, all the glamorous stuff. A scribe's education wasn't just about writing, though. It was math-heavy, too. They had to calculate weights, time, lease values, depreciation, yes, even goats depreciated, and interest. Their number system was based on 60, not 10, so if you ever hated math class, imagine trying it in base 60 while wearing sandals and getting pecked by pigeons. And here's a delightful twist. Scribes had a sense of humor. Some tablets include jokes, doodles, or snarky little comments. One even includes a fictional court case where a goat steals a merchant's beer and everyone sues each other. Historians debate whether this was satire, training material, or just someone really bored that day. But don't be fooled. This wasn't casual. Scribes were highly respected. In a society where most people were illiterate, the ability to write gave you power. Scribes could mediate, witness, and influence deals simply by what they chose to record. And because tablets couldn't be erased, once baked, every word mattered. You approach a tiny booth near the temple gate. A scribe sits there now, drowsy in the afternoon heat, stylus in hand, waiting for work. You wonder how many goat receipts he's written this week. 50? 100? Each one different, each one carved with deliberate care and just a hint of boredom. He waves lazily at you, eyes barely open. Another rental? You shake your head, just browsing. As you keep walking, you think about how much trust went into those little lumps of clay, not just between renter and lender, but in the scribes themselves. They were the living archive, the civil servants of Mesopotamia, keeping track of who owned what, who owed whom, and whose goat just knocked over the neighbor's fence. Without them, Babylon's economy wouldn't have worked. Not the fields, not the temples, not the markets, not your goat. And just think, every one of those clay receipts is still out there somewhere, waiting to be unearthed. In buried libraries, in forgotten houses, in the dry corners of ancient storerooms, some still legible thousands of years later. All thanks to the scribes who invented the world's first paper trail, the temple accountant and the goat gods. So there you are, strolling past those market stalls now winding down for the day. Your goat, once a little jittery, is gently tugging at a bundle of dry barley. But don't worry, she's not stealing. Technically, you're just, let's say, helping her inspect the merchandise. Now let's follow her nose. It's leading you somewhere interesting. An enormous step structure rising over the rooftops like a sleepy pyramid made of sun-baked bricks. That, my friend, is the ziggurat. And inside that ziggurat, among the priests' smoke and sleepy chants, the temple accountants. Now, I know what you're thinking. Temple accountants? Those sound like the least fun people in any religion. And you'd be absolutely right. But in Babylon, these guys weren't just bean counters. They were sacred bean counters. They managed the wealth of the gods themselves, which, fun fact, included goats. Lots and lots of goats. The temples weren't just places of worship. They were banks, granaries, universities, and rental agencies all rolled into one. You could pray to the gods, rent a donkey, enroll your child in scribe school, get a marriage contract, and pay your taxes, all without leaving temple grounds. Convenient? Yes. Chaotic? Also yes. Your goat gives a small snort as you pass through the outer courtyard, where grain is being measured in enormous baskets. A priest accountant is supervising, stylus behind one ear, clearly annoyed that someone's trying to slip in underweight barley. He's got a clay tablet in one hand, and he's muttering calculations in base 60. Now, here's something odd. Why did the temple need so many goats in the first place? Historians still argue whether all these goats were strictly religious offerings or just part of a massive divine livestock business. You see, people would bring goats to the temple to honor gods like Marduk or Ishtar, hoping for rain, health, love, or just a better barley harvest. But not every goat was sacrificed. Many were simply accepted, blessed, and then loaned back out. Imagine it. You offer your goat to the gods. They say, "Thank you," and then rent it out to someone else. Meanwhile, you get divine credit on your celestial record, and the temple earns a little extra barley from the goat's next renter. It's kind of like divine Airbnb, but with more bleeding. The temple kept immaculate records of all this. Every goat transaction, donation, rental, breeding, even death, was logged in the temple archives. Some temples even named the goats. There's one surviving tablet that lists goats called Gentle Nose, Cloud Hoof, and my personal favorite, Moist One. Don't ask. You pass an archive room now, filled with rows of clay cubbyholes, each holding dusty tablets. They smell like old bread and sand and secrets. A sleepy scribe in the corner looks up and blinks. He's probably been cataloging goat returns all afternoon. One record shows a goat leased to a farmer for plowing assistance. Another tablet details a goat's rental for a wedding ceremony. Apparently, she wore flowers and refused to cooperate with the flute player. It's all there, written in perfect cuneiform. The priest took this seriously because the goats technically belong to the gods. And when you borrow something from a god, you'd better return it in good condition. If the goat got sick, you owed a penalty. If she ran off, bigger penalty. If she died, hope you're friends with the high priest, because someone's sending a stern message to Ishtar. In some cases, the temples even offered goat insurance. Yes, really. For a small offering, usually in grain or beer, You could register your rental under divine protection. If the goat vanished during a sandstorm or got stolen by rival herders, the temple would waive some of your debt. As long as you weren't being dodgy, of course. There's a very passive-aggressive letter from one priest to a farmer that basically says, "We know you ate the goat. Please stop lying." And the system worked. By intertwining religion with economic accountability, Babylon created something truly unique, a divine bureaucracy. People trusted temple contracts because they carried spiritual weight. Break a rental agreement, and you weren't just annoying the lender, you were offending the gods. You could find yourself socially shamed, financially ruined, or spiritually cursed, all over a goat. But let's zoom out for a moment. Why goats? Why not sheep, cows, or chickens? Well, Babylonian terrain was dry and rugged, perfect for goats. Goats are hardy. They eat everything. They walk anywhere. They give milk, meat, and the occasional comic relief. And unlike cows, they don't require massive grazing pastures. For city dwellers or small-scale farmers, goats were the ideal livestock. Plus, goats had symbolic value. In certain rituals, goats were believed to carry sins away. They were also offered to deities like Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who apparently had a soft spot for floppy ears and stubborn attitudes. Some ancient hymns even praise goats for their cleverness, basically calling them the accountants of the animal kingdom. And let's not forget their role in fertility rituals. One particularly festive ceremony involved dressing goats in ribbons and letting them dance around a sacred tree. No one's sure why, possibly just for vibes. You sit on a cool stone bench now, your goat curled beside you like a hairy, slightly judgmental cat. You can hear the priests in the inner courtyard chanting praises to Marduk. Incense wafts through the air, mixing with the musky smell of grain and goat sweat. There's something oddly beautiful about it. This entire system, divine economics, clay receipts, priestly paperwork, it all hinges on trust. People brought their goats not just out of obligation, but because they believed the gods would watch over their assets. And the gods, well, let's just say they had excellent record-keeping departments. You stand brushing dust off your robe and walk past a mural showing a winged goat leaping over a field of stars. It's symbolic, obviously. Or maybe it's just ancient advertising. Either way, the message is clear. Babylon's temples didn't just guide your soul, they kept your ledger clean. And if you needed a goat for the week, you knew exactly where to go. You, a goat, and the world's first receipt. You've now left the temple grounds, still pondering how that dreamy, incense-drenched bureaucracy somehow ran on goat rentals and divine ledgers. The air outside is cooler now, with that soft bronze twilight settling over the alleys of Babylon. Your goat, having decided you are trustworthy enough to follow again, trots beside you, hooves clacking softly on the baked earth path. She's chewing something, hopefully not someone's tablet. But let's pause, just for a moment. Imagine you were the one receiving that goat from the temple. How would you prove it? How would you prove that goat 778, aka Gentle Nose, now belongs to you for the next 3 moons, or until she eats something she shouldn't? Enter the world's first receipt. Yes, the Babylonians were that organized. Around 3200 BCE in Sumer, Babylon's southern predecessor, humans stumbled into something big. They figured out that if you press symbols into wet clay with a sharpened reed and then let it dry, you've just created something incredible, permanent memory. Not in your head, not in a song, on a physical object that can outlive you, your goat, and even your house. The earliest receipts were basic. A small lump of clay, maybe the size of your palm with a few simple markings. 3 sheep, 1 goat, 2 bushels of barley. Lent to farmer Enlil on the 14th day of the moon cycle. Press a seal into it, sign your name, well, your cylinder seal, and voila, legal proof. Now, your goat looks skeptical. She's wondering how a tablet made of clay can possibly stop someone from stealing her. Well, here's how. Let's say you rent her from the temple. You walk off with this adorable fur ball and a freshly baked clay tablet that says, in clean cuneiform, Goat 778, leased to Nabu, son of Puzur, for 1 planting season. Return in good health or pay restitution. You carry that tablet everywhere. It's your passport, your receipt, your GPS tracker all rolled into one. Lose it, and you're not only facing an angry temple official, but possibly a long conversation involving omens, curses, and whether or not your crops will mysteriously fail this year. And they didn't just trust anyone to write these things. The scribes, the guys with pointy styluses and smug attitudes, were professionally trained. It took years to master the cuneiform script. Think thousands of tiny wedges jammed in precise patterns into wet clay. Left wedge, right wedge, downward triangle. Don't sneeze. Some scribes even developed signature styles like calligraphers. One tablet from Uruk actually says, written beautifully by Lu Sin, the finest hand in the temple. Imagine getting a Yelp review for your receipts. But it wasn't just about writing, it was about memory. You're living in a world where paper doesn't exist. Ink is too valuable to waste, and oral tradition just doesn't cut it when someone disputes a goat ownership claim. I swear on Marduk's beard, I didn't take your goat. Only goes so far when the temple has a signed clay receipt proving otherwise. And clay had staying power. Unlike parchment or papyrus, clay doesn't burn easily, mold quickly, or get eaten by rats. Thousands of years later, modern archaeologists are still finding these receipts intact, tucked inside ancient archives like forgotten emails in a dusty inbox. One particular tablet, discovered in a ruined temple storeroom, reads like an early rental agreement. It says, 2 male goats, unblemished, lent to Shulgimesh for pasture feeding. Must be returned by the 5th festival of Inanna. If lost, substitute with 2 goats of equal or greater worth. It's basically a goat collateral clause. And yes, someone had to carve all that into wet clay, backwards and without spilling their lunch. Your goat seems unimpressed. She's now rubbing her head against your hip like a sleepy cat, clearly ready for bed. But you're hooked. Because here's where it gets wild. Some receipts weren't tablets at all, they were tokens. Long before writing, the Sumerians used tiny clay objects shaped like animals, loaves of bread or bundles of wool to represent actual goods. These were sealed in hollow clay balls called bulli. If someone tried to break the ball early, they'd know it had been tampered with, sort of like the world's first tamper-proof packaging. Open it, and inside you'd find 5 little goat tokens, showing that, yes, you'd been given 5 goats. Later, scribes began pressing images of these tokens into the surface instead of storing them inside. That's when writing began to replace the tokens altogether. So every time you check your receipt at a grocery store or scan a QR code to track a delivery, you're participating in a tradition that started with goat tokens in ancient Mesopotamia. Historians still argue whether writing began primarily for commerce or for religion. Was it about counting goats or praising gods? But honestly, in Babylon, the line between the two was blurrier than a beer-soaked festival scroll. Goats were offerings in currency. Receipts were prayer records and tax statements. Clay wasn't just a medium, it was a sacred tool. And those little receipts, they told stories. Take the tablet from Lagash that records a woman named Ninbanda leasing a goat to a midwife during festival season, or another that shows a temple priest being fined for inaccurate accounting of 5 goats mysteriously lost during a sandstorm. Spoiler, the goats were later found drinking beer outside the market, allegedly. Every scratch in clay was a snapshot of real life. People traded, borrowed, promised, lied, paid fines, and begged for forgiveness, all tracked by this beautiful, durable mud technology. Now picture this. You're asleep in your reed house. Moonlight spills through the open doorway. Your goat is curled at your feet, snoring gently. And just under your headrest, a cool, smooth clay tablet. It bears your name, your promise, your borrowed goat. You're not a thief, a liar, or a forgetful borrower. You're a participant in the very beginnings of human civilization, someone who believes that agreements matter, that records protect us, and that even the gods want a tidy ledger. So sleep well, little scribe. Tomorrow the goat goes back, but the receipt, that stays with you forever. Goat economics and the price of a bleat. You're up early. Not by choice, of course. The goat is awake, and when a Babylonian goat is awake, the whole neighborhood knows about it. She's bleating at nothing in particular, chewing her way through a half-dry palm frond like it owes her money. It's barely dawn, and the ziggurat glows faintly under a dusty lavender sky. You stretch, glance over at your ever-important clay receipt, and begin to consider a question no one in your household has asked quite so directly. Just how much is a goat worth in ancient Babylon? Well, friend, welcome to the wide, complicated world of ancient economics, where the value of a bleat could shift with the moon phase, crop yields, and whether or not some foreign king had decided to flood your trade routes last week. Because in Babylon, a goat wasn't just livestock. It was the capital. It was future cheese. It was milk for your kids, wool for your robe, a sacrifice to appease the gods, and sometimes even the equivalent of your tax refund. Let's start with the basics. Babylon ran on a barter economy, mostly. There were no coins yet. Instead, trade happened in goods, labor, or weights of silver measured in shekels. Yes, the word's that old. 1 shekel was roughly 8.3 grams of silver, and prices were usually written as X units of silver per Y item. So what's the going rate for a goat? In a surviving tablet from the reign of Hammurabi, yes, the guy with the famously long coat of laws, 1 healthy female goat is listed as being worth about 2 to 3 shekels of silver. That's enough to buy roughly 50 loaves of barley bread or rent a decent-sized plot of land for a month. But here's the twist. That price wasn't fixed. Like modern markets, goat prices could surge during religious festivals when sacrifices peaked, drop after a baby boom in the herds, or fluctuate based on pasture conditions. It's a bit like the stock market, but with more bleeding. One hilarious note from a merchant in Sippar complains that goat prices have become absurd and blames it on a rival priesthood hoarding the best grazing land for their divine herds. Babylonian supply chain drama, folks. Some things never change. Historians still argue whether these market swings were managed by any kind of official regulation, or if prices simply followed the organic chaos of local demand. Some cities had scribes who published standard values monthly, like dusty proto-price tags. Others just let sellers and buyers hash it out, possibly over loud arguments and spilled beer. Your goat, meanwhile, is now testing the structural integrity of your neighbor's fence. She's got expensive taste, and unfortunately, the fence is probably worth more than she is. But it wasn't just about the raw cost of a goat, it was also about what that goat could do. Think of her as an investment vehicle. A good nanny goat could produce a liter of milk a day for several months. Milk could be made into cheese, yogurt, or even fermented into a weird, tangy drink they swore was good for digestion. Goat manure was a precious fertilizer. Babylonians were big on composting before it was trendy. And if you had a male goat, well, now you're in the breeding business, my friend. Temples often leased out prized breeding goats, usually larger, stronger males with excellent horns and a good reputation among the ladies. You'd pay more for the privilege, but the offspring could fetch serious value down the line. There's even a comical tablet from Larsa where a farmer sues another for claiming his goat was of sacred bloodline, when it clearly was small, mean, and prone to biting. A Babylonian case of false advertising. Sometimes goats were used to pay wages. If you worked on a construction crew building irrigation canals or helped lay bricks for a public granary, you might be paid in food, clothing, or occasionally a goat. One goat for 10 days' labor, a decent bargain if the goat survived the month. But not everyone was thrilled. One laborer writes home saying, "I asked for silver. They gave me a goat. It has worms." We also have evidence that goat leasing became surprisingly complex. Some receipts note terms like kid included if pregnant, or only milk-producing goats accepted. One contract outlines the agreement that if the goat does not produce milk within one moon cycle, the lender will provide an alternate goat or return 2/3 of the payment. It's basically a livestock warranty. And of course, there was goat-based collateral. Let's say you're a weaver. You need barley now, but your harvest won't come in for 3 moons. You pledge your goat as security. If you can't repay the barley loan, the lender gets to keep the goat. Sometimes it wasn't the goat itself, but the goat's future kids that were pledged. Imagine borrowing grain today and promising a goat that hasn't even been born yet. That's how deeply tied livestock was to the Babylonian economy. Now, here's a fun fringe tidbit. Some temples employed what we might call goat inspectors. These were specialized herders who could assess the health, age, and breeding potential of a goat. Kind of like appraisers crossed with veterinarians. One surviving list records their duties, which included checking hoof integrity, udder fullness, horn symmetry, and obedience to sacred whistle. Apparently, some goats were trained to respond to a specific flute sound. It's unclear if this actually worked. You wander into the market again now, clay receipt in your belt sash, goat in tow, and ears full of shouting. Traders are arguing over sesame seed prices. A woman is offering 6 dates for 1 smoked fish. And down at the livestock end, it's Goat Central. There's a whole row of bleating, stomping, stubborn personalities waiting for new homes. A boy is tugging on his mother's sleeve, begging for a spotted one with the clever eyes. An older man is inspecting a goat's teeth like he's buying a used chariot. And standing nearby, a temple clerk. His stylus is ready. His expression says, "I don't trust your math." This is more than a market. This is a delicate economic web built on trust, timing, and the humble goat. But let's not romanticize too much. Babylonian markets could be chaotic, loud, and slightly corrupt. One text warns buyers to examine all teeth before purchase, lest you be sold a spirit goat. What's a spirit goat? Historians aren't entirely sure. Maybe one that dies mysteriously. Maybe one that refuses to be milked. Maybe just a metaphor for buyer's remorse. You finally spot someone you've been looking for. A merchant with good boots, better balance, and 3 goats tied behind him, all chewing at the same feed bucket. He nods at your receipt. You nod back. You're not buying, you're just comparing. Because now you know, every goat is an economic decision. Every bleat is a transaction waiting to happen. And with your receipt in hand, your goat at your side, and the ancient markets of Babylon unfolding before you, you realize you're not just a goat owner anymore. You're a player in one of history's oldest economies. The temple audit and the case of the missing goat. Your goat is fed, your receipt is still intact, and your confidence in ancient Babylonian accounting is at an all-time high. At least it was, till now. Because as you pass by the towering entrance to the temple storehouse, something in the air shifts. The gate is open. The scribes are not humming their usual clay-clicking lullabies, and there, pacing near a towering shelf of barley records, is a priest with a furrowed brow deep enough to plant onions in. It's audit day. That's right. The temples didn't just hand out goats, record loans, and hope the universe sorted things out. They performed regular audits, meticulous, sometimes grumpy cross-checks of every goat, sheep, barley bag, and silver ingot that passed through their hands. You try to keep walking, but a novice scribe gestures for you to wait. This isn't about your goat, they assure you. Sure, it isn't. You glance down at her. She's currently chewing on her own tether like she's in training to escape goat jail. And the priest? He's now turning over a small clay tablet, holding it up to the light like it might whisper secrets. It's one of the thousands of receipts stored here, each pressed with cuneiform, each a tiny promise made by someone just like you. You're about to witness the Babylonian version of an investigation. Here's how it works. Every month, or every moon cycle, depending on the temple's size and fussiness, senior scribes would select a stack of outgoing receipts and trace the paper trail, well, the clay trail, back to the original transaction. Did Shumu really borrow those 5 goats for his barley harvest? Did he return them? Were they in sound physical condition as the tablet promised? If not, someone had some serious explaining to do. One of the scribes now pulls out a slightly larger tablet with rounded corners, the Babylonian equivalent of a spreadsheet. It's a master ledger showing all goats on temple property, their condition, status, and assigned keeper. The term for these was often Anshu Shah Shamali, those recorded by writing. But today there's a problem. Goat, or 4423. A mid-sized female, dappled gray, noted for a limp in the left hind leg. Last listed as returned by a farmer 3 weeks ago. According to his receipt, she was delivered back in full health. Except she never actually arrived. You hear hushed debate. Did someone misplace her? Was she stolen from the pasture before temple staff could update the records? Or, most embarrassingly of all, was the scribe who stamped the return tablet just a little too relaxed with the truth? Historians still argue whether these audits were mostly symbolic, a way to keep scribes nervous, or fully enforced systems with consequences ranging from fines to expulsion from temple service. What we do know is that scribes did go to extraordinary lengths to confirm livestock returns. There's a hilarious complaint letter from one scribe in Uruk who claims, "I walked 6 hours to confirm 3 goats and was bitten by 2. One of them might not have been ours. They all look the same." The priest now motions to a young assistant, barefoot, hair tied back, with an ink-stained tunic. She's sent running to the livestock pens behind the temple complex to do a head count. This isn't just bureaucracy. This is a crisis of trust. And here's where things get spicy. Because unlike the cool, detached image we have of temple record keepers, Babylonian scribes were deeply human. They made mistakes. They showed favoritism. They fudged numbers to protect friends. There are entire records of temple corruption cases, complete with clay tablet testimonies from accused staff. One stunning find from the city of Kish details a temple audit in which 3 scribes were accused of faking goat returns by swapping one animal between 3 different farmers over the course of a week. They gave each farmer a receipt, collected their barley repayment, and kept the goat moving like it was on a very furry contour. Another fragment from Nippur features a scribe's personal journal, rare and possibly never meant to be public. In it, he confesses to approving an animal return he never saw. It was dusk. I was tired. I trusted the man. The goat is belatedly honest. That, my friend, is what you call trust-based accounting. Of course, not all goats vanished because of human mischief. Babylon was a big city. Gates were left open. Predators wandered too close. Some goats simply wandered off or fell ill. And if one died in temple custody, well, that triggered an entirely different process, the divine compensation ritual. Yes, if a goat was lost while in service to the gods, a replacement had to be offered, often accompanied by a prayer, a small barley cake, and occasionally an apology hymn. One dusty receipt reads, "Goat lost in flood. Replacement offered with praise to Nana, god of the moon. Cake consumed, loss forgiven." Right now, your goat looks far too alive to be forgiven for anything. She's attempting to climb a clay crate. Back at the audit, things are heating up. A second scribe has retrieved a supplementary tablet that contradicts the original return record. It seems that the goat in question may have been returned 2 days late and possibly handed off to the wrong clerk. The investigation pivots. This isn't theft. It's a clerical mix-up, which, in Babylon, could still land you in serious trouble. He watches the scribes compare seal impressions. Each official had a unique cylinder seal, rolled across wet clay to verify authorship. The seals were beautiful, carved with images of gods, animals, celestial patterns, or family crests. They were worn on cords like jewelry and guarded like debit cards. Some scribes even had backup seals in case one cracked. The clerk who supposedly received Goat 443, his seal appears on the tablet, but it looks off, just slightly. The impression is blurry, the border wobbly. It might be a fake. Forgery wasn't common, but it did happen. One infamous case from Mari describes a seal swap scandal where 2 junior scribes traded seals to falsify goat inventories. They were discovered when one left his lunch behind, complete with tablet impressions that didn't match the day's records. You don't know how today's case will end. Maybe the goat is just hiding. Maybe someone tried to cover up a lost animal to avoid a fine. Maybe this is all a big misunderstanding. But what you do know, standing there with your goat munching on your sandal, is that this temple doesn't just hand out goats and walk away. They keep track. They check receipts. They hold people accountable. And that humble little slab of clay you carry, it's not just a receipt. It's protection. It's identity. It's a sliver of ancient justice in a world where even a goat can cause divine paperwork. You nod politely to the scribes, slip quietly out of the audit zone, and head back into the comforting chaos of the city. But a part of you lingers behind, marveling at a world where faith, finance, and 4-legged creatures were so tightly bound together by clay, styluses, and sharp-eyed temple clerks. Goats may wander, but receipts, they remain. The scribe's apprentice and the price of ink. You're not trying to be nosy. You just want to return the goat safely and maybe grab a fresh barley beer on the way home. But then you spot her. The same ink-stained novice from the temple audit, sitting under a fig tree with her head bent low over a broken stylus and a look of total defeat on her face. She sees you. You see her. And now you're caught in a full Babylonian stare-off. Eventually she sighs, waves you over, and mutters something under her breath about goats, audits, and curses from Enlil. You sit nearby, careful not to disturb her wax tablets, which she's scraped clean more times than you can count. It's easy to forget that behind every crisp, cuneiform receipt is a human being, often very young, very tired, and very much learning through trial and error. You found yourself in the orbit of a scribe's apprentice, which means tonight we're going behind the scenes of Babylonian bureaucracy. Not the polished tablets of the elite or the weighty proclamations of kings, but the ink spills, barked orders, and feverish note-taking of someone trying to make it to full scribe status without losing their mind, or their stylus. The scribal path was long. It started usually at a temple school called an aduba, literally the tablet house. Think of it as a cross between a private school, tutoring center, and a slow-moving boot camp for future accountants and poets. You didn't just waltz in. You needed a sponsor, sometimes a family member, sometimes a priest who saw potential in your stick-straight handwriting. Most students were boys, though there are traces of women scribes in certain cities like Sippar, especially in family-run scribal dynasties. The first year was brutal. You copied hundreds of lines of standard phrases. The ox is in the field. The ox is not in the field. The barley is measured. The measure is precise. If you messed up a wedge, your teacher, a stern figure often called the Ummah, might make you recite the entire phrase backwards, or worse, clean the courtyard of goat droppings. There's even an old student tablet that reads, pitifully, "I was whipped 10 times today for slouching." Still, the reward was worth it. Full scribes didn't just write, they held power. They were translators, tax officers, letter writers, legal advisors, and guardians of knowledge. And the ink? Oh, the ink. Here's where it gets juicy. Contrary to the popular image of dusty scribes scratching clay all day, many also worked with ink, especially when copying manuscripts on papyrus or parchment, rare but real in later Mesopotamian libraries, or drafting outlines on wax tablets. Ink was made from soot, crushed minerals, or even squid-like creatures pulled from the Gulf. One recipe recommends boiling oak galls and mixing them with goat urine for extra staying power. The smell? Pungent but persuasive, according to one surviving comment. The apprentice beside you groans. Her ink's too runny again. She tries thickening it with ash, mutters a prayer to Nisaba, the goddess of scribes, and tries again. You ask gently what she's working on. "Borrowed goats," she replies, "and one sheep, returned late. Might have been twins." This is no small error. In Babylonian accounting, twins born during a rental period often had to be declared and paid for separately, especially if they lived to weaning age. A single sheep becoming 3, that's a tax liability and a major scribing headache. The tablet in her lap lists dates, names, and symbols like triangles, goat ears, small hooks, sheep tails, and a curious star-like glyph that might mean disputed. You learn that she's trying to match one farmer's word to the physical record. The farmer swears he returned 1 sheep. The temple herders say it was 2. The receipt says nothing. Historians still argue whether these young apprentices had authority to alter records or only copied existing tablets under supervision. But there's no question. They were the engine of the record-keeping system. Thousands of routine loans, contracts, and payments flowed through their aching wrists. You watch her fingers, calloused, ink-smudged, nimble. Each wedge she presses is deliberate, even when she's unsure of the meaning. And in between strokes, she mutters formulas like spells: 1 goat, 3 barley measures, delivery complete. Witness, Lugal son of Enki. She tells you about her teacher who smells like fish and quotes Hammurabi in his sleep. about the senior scribe who once copied a tax tablet with 2 digits reversed and accidentally fined a man 10 times the actual amount, and about the time she got caught practicing love poetry instead of grain inventory and had to scrub the wax tablets with salt water for an entire week. And then she shares something extraordinary. She shows you a small worn token on a string, her seal. It's rough. Just a simple fish design, nothing like the elaborate lions or gods carved into senior seals. But it's hers, given to her by her teacher when she correctly transcribed a lease for a team of oxen. Seals, you learn, were often awarded in stages. First, a training seal, then, if you lasted through audits, a provisional seal. Full scribes got the best ones, sometimes passed down generations, engraved with mythical scenes or personalized blessings. And here's the kicker. She's not from Babylon. She's from a small farming village upriver where most girls were married off by 14. Her uncle paid a priest to let her study here on the promise that she'd someday return and run a local temple school. Her name is Aluni. She's 16. And she's going to be the first full scribe in her family in 3 generations. You blink. Somewhere along the line, this stopped being about goats. It's about stories, authority, the written word. In ancient Babylon, to be a scribe was to have your voice preserved. Not your spoken words, but your thoughts. Immortalized in clay, left for gods, kings, or nosy future archaeologists to read. Even now, fragments of tablets exist that simply say things like, "I am tired. My ink is dry." No one listens to me. They weren't meant for kings or courts. They were just human voices, scratched into permanence. As Aluni packs up, the sky turns golden. She's due back at the dormitory before sundown. Her stylus clicks into its pouch. The ink is sealed tight with wax. Her goat ledger isn't finished, but she's earned a break. Before she leaves, she offers you a trade. 1 small practice tablet, her worst handwriting, she insists, for 1 goat hair. Yep, the one nibbling your robe. You accept. It's lopsided. Some symbols are smudged. The sentence structure is awkward. But it's a real Babylonian tablet. And now it's yours. You carry it home in your satchel, feeling the weight of history not just in kings or laws, but in every tired apprentice who ever pressed a stylus and dared to dream they might one day sign their name. Gods, goats, and the grand temple audit. You wake to the sound of bells, not cheerful little chimes or temple hymns, but the heavy, jangly, sleep-destroying bells tied to the necks of very annoyed goats. Dozens of them, all being herded in front of the temple. You rub your eyes. Yesterday's goat return should have been the end of it. But no, today is the dreaded grand audit. An event so serious it makes even seasoned scribes double-check their decimals and bribe temple cooks for calming date cakes. Once a year, sometimes twice, depending on which god the city is currently trying to impress, temple officials perform a full inventory. Not just of livestock, but of barley stores, oil jars, tools, beads, ceremonial garments, and any humans who might be contractually tied to temple service. Like you, possibly, depending on what that goat receipt really says. The main square is chaos. Scribes bustle around with armfuls of tablets. Priests chant invocations to Enlil and Marduk to reveal all dishonesty. Shepherds wrangle animals into shaded pens. 1 goat escapes and crashes straight into a priest's fruit tray. The temple guard tries not to laugh and fails spectacularly. You naturally are waved over immediately, because, surprise, your goat is missing from the tally, not physically. It's still here, chewing on a papyrus scroll it really shouldn't be chewing. But according to the temple's records, the goat was never returned. See? the senior scribe says, flipping through clay tablets like they're cheap note cards. It went out, wasn't checked back in. No seal, no date, no counter witness. You point to the blurry thumbprint from the rental kiosk. That's my seal, you insist, or at least the goat's. Historians still argue whether these temple audits were mostly ceremonial or truly rigorous accounting exercises. Some believe they were a blend, part religious ritual, part spreadsheet frenzy. Others think they served more as public theater, showing the gods and the citizens that the temples ran a tight, divine ship. Either way, you're stuck until this is cleared up. A junior priest scurries by with a jar of honey. Don't worry, he whispers. They once lost 30 ducks and blamed it on a sandstorm. You'll be fine. Comforting. A very serious man wearing a lion-tooth necklace begins the audit proceedings with a chant to Shamash, the sun god and bringer of justice. Then comes the parade of items. First up, livestock. Each goat, sheep, and ox is brought forward, its tag read aloud, its lineage declared. Goat of Enlil's field, first generation, dam by sheep number 4, owner Barutu the miller, rental, half season. Returned? Affirmative. Condition? Pregnant. They really do check everything. Your goat, still defiant, is examined by 2 veterinary priests, one old enough to have personally diagnosed the legendary temple camel who ate fermented barley and sang hymns for 3 days straight. She's healthy, they confirm, but she was overdue by 1 night. And here's where the trouble begins. 1 night late, plus an unclear receipt, plus your total lack of social standing, equals temple penalty. Now, Babylonian penalties weren't always cruel. You wouldn't be whipped or tossed in a pit of scorpions. But you might owe a barley fine, or a days of service repayment, or in rare cases, an oral compensation which meant reciting proverbs aloud to temple children for 3 full afternoons. The senior scribe strokes his beard. You appear honest, he says slowly, but policy is policy. Before you can respond, Iluni appears, ink-stained, slightly breathless, with a full tablet in hand. I reviewed the ledger, she says, voice steady. That goat was returned on time. The receipt got misfiled under sheep. The error is ours. Murmurs ripple through the crowd. A novice correcting a senior's record, scandalous. But her stylus strokes are crisp, her dates match, and luckily the head priest is in a generous mood. Very well, he says. Let the goat be cleared. And let the record show that scribal diligence preserved order today. Just like that, you're exonerated. Iluni flashes you a quick smile. Your mouth, thank you. Now that goats are done, the audit moves to grain. You decide to linger. It's not every day you see 100 clay jars being weighed, inspected, and sniffed by men in gold-trimmed robes. One priest is particularly dramatic, tapping each jar like a wine critic. This barley, he says, was watered with tears of the north wind. Acceptable. Next comes oil. This is tricky. Oil jars are often reused, their seals remelted. Some temples developed complex tracking systems. A jar's origin, use, refill history, all recorded in an abbreviated cuneiform near the base. Quirky fact? Some oil jars had little figurines embedded in the clay, miniature fish, birds, or eyes. Scholars still debate whether these were decorative, magical, or just a way to tell the jars apart without reading. You lean close to one. It has a tiny frog carved into the handle. You name him Audit. The final item category is temple textiles, robes, sashes, ceremonial curtains, all dyed with rare pigments, often imported from far regions like Elam or Dilmun. One scrap is indigo, another beet red. The colors are vibrant even in the heat. You wonder how many hands touched this fabric, how many stories they carried. Then unexpectedly, the head priest calls for a blessing. May Nisaba, goddess of writing, watch over these records. May no goat go uncounted. May no jar go unsealed. May the scribe's hands be steady and their ink never dry. Iluni lowers her head. Others do the same. The square falls quiet. Even the goats hush. You feel a strange weight in your chest. Not fear, not stress. Something like reverence. For all the fuss, all the tallying and tug-of-wars over who owns what and who owes whom, this moment, the great audit under the sun, feels timeless. Here are the ancients, not in battle, not at war, but organizing, arguing, cooperating, writing things down, trying to leave behind a world that made sense, and it all hinges on the humble receipt. By sundown, the audit ends. A feast begins. Nothing too wild, just bread, lentils, honeyed beer, and a lot of relieved laughter. You're invited to stay. You do. You dance a little. You eat more than you should. Iluni gets hoisted onto someone's shoulders for saving the audit, and your goat wins most persistent escape attempts, earning it a wreath of fig leaves and a solemn pat from the veterinary priest. As the stars blink into view, you sit by the temple wall, your belly full, your heart light. Somewhere in the archives, a receipt now bears your name, or at least a wobbly wedge version of it. And that, in Babylon, makes you officially part of history, of clay, contracts, and curses. You don't mean to eavesdrop, but when a scribe mutters the phrase, "He cursed his neighbor over a goat dispute," you can't help leaning closer. You're back in the temple archives, dust still clinging to your sandals from the audit the day before. Iluni invited you to watch the sorting of receipts and rental tablets. But, as you're quickly learning, these tablets don't just record who borrowed a goat and when they brought it back. Some are laced with threats, elegant, terrifying, bureaucratically binding curses. You'll like this one, Iluni says, brushing off a small square of clay. It's not just a receipt, it's a contract for the rental of a goat with a divine clause. She tilts it toward you. If this man fails to return the goat unharmed, she translates softly, may Nergal strike his fields with drought, his sons with boils, and his dreams with restless ghosts. Bit harsh for a goat, no? But apparently, invoking the gods in legal documents was common, especially in Babylon, where every action was believed to ripple into the spiritual realm. Failing to honor your word wasn't just bad manners, it was cosmic misconduct. And writing down a curse? That was like handing your gods a direct line to smite someone. As you roll another clay contract between your fingers, you realize something oddly human. These people were terrified of being cheated. In a society built on barter, trust, and seasonal dependency, even one missing goat or tampered jug of oil could unbalance a household, or a temple, or an entire district. So they fought back the best way they knew how, by documenting everything and backing it with divine firepower. Historians still argue, Iluni says as she flips through more tablets, whether the curses were meant to be taken literally, or just as scary metaphors to keep people honest. You read one aloud. May Shamash see your theft and blot out your name from memory. That doesn't sound very metaphorical. As the hours roll on, you start to understand the logic behind it all. Clay tablets weren't just paperwork. They were safeguards, stories, weapons, proof, anchors in a world that could turn on you with a bad harvest or a jealous neighbor. Iluni pulls out a larger piece, half broken, still legible. "This one's rare," she says. "A receipt with a witness poem." You blink. "A what?" She grins. "Listen." Her voice slips into chant. "By moon's round light and city's gate, I saw the goat. Its step was straight. I swear by Ishtar's silver eye, returned it was, no harm, no lie." You stare at her. "A goat receipt, written like a lullaby?" She nods. "Some scribes were bored, others were poets." This was another quirky corner of Babylonian accounting, the flair. Receipts didn't have to be dry. Sometimes they included doodles, tiny goat sketches, personal jokes, and once in a while, verse. This receipt was likely composed by a temple scribe trying to impress someone, perhaps their supervisor, perhaps a crush in the ink room. Maybe they just had a flair for drama. You glance around the archive chamber, the sun slanting through the slatted roof, casting long shadows across rows of drying clay. Some tablets are still soft, fresh from the stylus. Others are brittle, cracked, centuries old. They lie together, goats and gods, dates and debts, all equal in the eyes of time. You ask Iluni, "What happens when someone loses a receipt?" She frowns. "Depends. If you're lucky, the temple has a backup. If not, it's your word against theirs. Hence the importance of counterseals. Most receipts bore not just the scribe's mark, but the borrower's cylinder seal, an engraved rolling stamp worn like jewelry. Iluni hands you one. "Here, try it." You roll it across a soft clay blank. The image reveals itself, a row of kneeling goats beneath a stylized palm tree. You realize the owner of this seal loved goats enough to wear them around their wrist permanently, not for fashion, for proof. In Babylon, proof was everything. Your name, your land, your rights. These weren't things you yelled in a marketplace. They were pressed into clay, quiet, precise, immutable, or at least as immutable as sun-baked dirt could be. Later, as you watch scribes carry tablets to the furnace for hardening, Iluni points out a peculiar one. It's unusually heavy, carved deeper than most. "It's a double contract," she explains. "One goat rental, 2 parties, both signatures. And look, here's the kicker." She turns it over. The back of the tablet contains an identical copy. Same wording, same seals. "You see," she says, "sometimes they couldn't trust even their own colleagues, so they'd inscribe both the front and back. If someone tried to alter the front after firing, the misalignment would show. Think of it like clay encryption." Now it's you who laughs. The world's first anti-fraud department. You lean against a column, the heat of the kiln soft in the air, the scent of baked earth and ink surrounding you. You feel connected, somehow, like you're not just observing history, you're living a shadow of it. People say ancient Babylonians were obsessed with gods, but in truth, maybe they were just obsessed with order. With making sure goats got returned, those debts were remembered, that life didn't slide off the record like footprints in sand, and when the order failed, they wrote curses. You ask Iluni, half joking, "Do you ever want to curse someone on a tablet?" She smirks. "Only the guy who keeps stealing my lunch dates at the scribe school. One more fig theft and I'm invoking Inanna. By the time the day ends, you've handled more receipts than you can count. Goat rentals, plow rentals, basket rentals. Even one for a single pair of ceremonial sandals, borrowed for exactly 6 hours and then mysteriously never mentioned again. But the final tablet Iluni shows you isn't a receipt. Not really, it's a memorial." She brushes it off with a reverent hand. "This one," she says, was made by a herder. His goat drowned in a flood. He knew he'd owe the temple full value. So he brought this. It's not a contract. It's an apology. She reads it aloud, voice slow. She was mine. I fed her date seeds. She slept in my tent. The waters took her, sudden and black. I will pay, but I grieve. You sit with that. A goat? A flood? A man's sorrow pressed into clay, hoping some priest would read it and show mercy. No curses, no seals, just grief and responsibility etched in baked earth. In the stillness that follows, Iluni gently returns the tablet to its shelf. You know now that Babylonian receipts weren't about goats. Not really. They were about memory, about people trying to outlast the chaos of their world, to inscribe fairness, accountability, and sometimes loss into something that might last longer than a voice. Come on, Iluni says quietly. Let's go find a goat that didn't drown. You've earned a snack. All in a day's goat work. You wake the next morning to the sound of gentle bleating. No, you're not dreaming. A goat is nuzzling the outside of your sleeping mat with what can only be described as determined curiosity. Its little nose is sniffing around for breakfast, and you, flat on your back and barely awake, are apparently in its way. Iluni laughs softly from somewhere above you. That one's Bila. She thinks your blanket is a turnip. You sit up, squinting into the golden light of dawn which is filtering through the reed walls of the small herder's tent. Today, you're shadowing a man named Dumazi, a low-ranking but endlessly talkative herdsman who rents goats from the temple, yes, with receipts, and manages a cluster of animals that belong not to him, but to Nanshi, the goddess of fertility and freshwater. Iluni made the introduction last night. If you want to understand why receipts matter, she said, you need to spend a day where the ink dries, out in the fields. Dumazi greets you with a cheerful slap on the back and a goat skin full of barley water. You'll walk, you'll sweat, and maybe you'll get bit, he says, but you'll come out with hooves in your heart. A gentle way to say, goats are going to become your whole personality today. And so, your day begins. You trudge behind Dumazi as he leads a small herd toward a dusty patch of pasture just past the river bend. The goats are unruly. They dart left and right like they're being chased by invisible spirits. One climbs a low wall for no apparent reason. Another attempts to eat the tag tied to its own leg. This one's due back in 3 days, Dumazi says, pointing to a particularly smug-looking goat with an extra cord of woven blue beads. He belongs to a brewer. She only needed him to trim weeds near her mash vats. Wait, goat landscaping? Yes, Dumazi confirms. Weed control, fertilization, and companionship, all included in the daily rate, and he listens to flute music. You're not sure if he's joking. Dumazi doesn't always clarify. As the morning wears on, you get into the rhythm of herding, sort of. Goats are not sheep. They don't follow. They scatter, explore, and challenge authority in ways that feel deeply personal. You chase one through a cabbage patch and nearly trip over a ceremonial stone left by some priest decades ago. Dumazi laughs and throws you a stick. You have to speak their language, grunt like this, hunk, hunk, and stand sideways. It makes you seem bigger. Historians still argue whether early herders like Dumazi were considered professionals or merely expendable help. You'd argue that anyone who can successfully wrangle 10 goats, 3 rental agreements, and a field full of bees deserves their own temple mural. Around mid-morning, Dumazi pulls out a small clay token from his satchel. What's that? You ask, catching your breath after retrieving a goat from a tree. Don't ask. "Rental stub," he says, matter-of-factly. I gave the real receipt to the temple scribe. "But this proves I took 10 goats out today. If I come back with 9, someone's going to want an explanation." These stubs, small circular tokens with pictographs, were a simple but effective way to track livestock in the field. Not all herders could read or write, but they knew what symbols to look for. A goat with 2 horns, a time marker, a sun over a hill for day, a crescent for night. It was a visual contract, hard to fake. Damazi even has a pouch of older tokens, hardened over time. "These are for longer rentals," he says, holding up one with a more elaborate design. 3 goats, 30 days, with a return by the festival of rain. Later, by the shade of a sycamore, you pause for lunch. Flat barley cakes, dates, and a surprisingly creamy goat cheese. You try not to think too hard about how fresh it is. Damazi is surprisingly philosophical for a goat guy. He tells you stories between bites, of a goat that once led an entire herd across a flooded causeway, saving a village's grain, of a temple clerk who miscounted goats and was reassigned to scrub latrines for a year, and of the time he himself lost a goat to a lion. "I brought back the hoof," he says with a shrug. Priest said that was fair enough. Still, he had to make an offering, not just of a replacement goat, but a reed figurine, his own carving, to Nanshi, the goddess. Just in case she was watching when the lion struck. Here, in the middle of the field, surrounded by goat sounds and warm wind, it hits you. Goat rentals weren't just logistics, they were spiritual. Every animal in Damazi's care was considered temporarily divine property. To lose one wasn't just a financial hit, it was an act of negligence toward the gods. You begin to see the layers. A scribe might log the goat as returned in good health, minus tail tuft, but the herder remembers the storm, the mud, the sleepless night of searching. The receipt is the skeleton. The story, his story, is the soul. That afternoon you helped Damazi wash the goats at the river. It's less bathing, more chasing soggy hooves through reeds, but you manage to stay upright. Barely. The temple expects all returned goats to be presentable, ritually acceptable, as Iluni had explained. No open wounds, no aggressive behavior, no visible signs of possession. Yes, that was a clause in some rentals. Apparently, one goat once returned with its eyes rolled upward and bleated in 3 tones. That goat was immediately sacrificed, or promoted, no one's quite sure. You dry off next to a young goat with one ear bent backward like a badly folded papyrus. She nudges you softly, you nudge back. Goat diplomacy. Back at the pens just before dusk, Damazi does a head count. "All here," he mutters. "No curses tonight." But you're curious. What if they weren't? He grimaces. "Then we write, or we cry, or we trade something else to the temple. Sometimes they'll accept woven mats, or grain, or..." He glances sideways. "Labor. You remember one receipt Iluni showed you? A man who returned only 7 of 8 goats promised to work at the ziggurat for 8 days to make up the difference. Goat-to-brick exchange, she'd called it. As you help close the pen gates, you realize how dependent everyone is on everyone else. The herder on the scribe, the brewer on the goat on the herder, the priest on all of it. A civilization built on the honor system, with proof baked in. You sit down on a stone, exhausted but content, and Damazi joins you. The goats bleat softly behind you, already settling into their evening rhythm. He pulls out a stylus and a small clay board. "Want to write today's tally?" You hesitate, but he hands you the tool. Slowly, awkwardly, you press signs into the clay. 10 goats, 1 missing sandal, yours, 3 bee stings, 0 curses. He leans over to admire your work. Not bad. Could use more flair. Maybe a goat drawing? You add a squiggly line with tiny ears. Perfect, he says. And just like that, you've made your first Babylonian receipt. Scribal gossip and clay secrets. It's the next morning, and today you're indoors. Well, sort of. You're crouched inside a dim, clay-walled room that smells like dry dust and lamp oil. You're surrounded by long wooden tables stacked with narrow trays, each lined with rows of unfired clay tablets. It's colder here than outside, and quieter, though not silent. The only sounds are the gentle tap, tap, tap of styluses on clay and the occasional clearing of a throat from the back of the room. This is the scribal hall, and your guide today is a man named Idin Sin. He wears his hair oiled and pulled back, his linen tunic neatly pressed, and his sandals suspiciously clean. He's a temple scribe, and proud of it. You can tell because he smiles like a man who knows everyone's secrets, including yours. So, he says, handing you a thin stylus, you want to learn how to catch a goat thief without lifting a finger? You nod, curious. Good, he replies, and sit down quietly and watch. You settle beside him at one of the long tables. Across from you, a younger scribe is carefully copying the wedge-shaped impressions of a rental receipt onto a fresh slab of wet clay. It's a little like calligraphy, but with fewer flourishes and more squinting. Every mark matters, because every mark might need to stand up in temple court. Idin Sin leans over and points to a tiny corner of the receipt. See that wedge cluster? That's the herder's identification mark. Not his name, he might be illiterate, but his symbol. It's like a signature, only harder to fake. He pulls a second tablet from the stack and places it beside the first. This one, it's the return record. If the symbols don't match, boom, investigation. You didn't know scribes used boom as punctuation, but you're enjoying the drama. As the hours stretch by, you watch the scribes work with a quiet efficiency that borders on hypnotic. Some are copying old contracts into longer ledgers, while others are preparing summaries for temple records. Occasionally, someone gets up to rotate a tablet that's drying in the sun or to blow gently on a stubborn piece of clay. You're tempted to ask why they don't just use ink and papyrus like the Egyptians. But you already know the answer. Clay lasts, papyrus rots. Babylonian receipts were meant to outlive their users. Idin Sin says it best, we don't write for the moment, we write for the gods, and for the nosy grandson who digs up your debt 800 years from now. He isn't exaggerating. Historians still argue whether the majority of these receipts were ever read again after being filed, or whether they were symbolic, a sort of spiritual ledger for cosmic accountability. Some think temple bureaucrats used them mostly for record keeping. Others suggest they were baked and stored to invoke divine memory, making the gods themselves witnesses to every goat transaction. You're beginning to see why people found this job sacred. These weren't just receipts, they were tiny testaments of trust, bound by gods, goats, and gossip. Speaking of gossip, during a short meal break, roasted onions, dried figs, and sour wine from a communal jug, Idin Sin lowers his voice and starts telling you stories. There was once a man, he begins, who rented 7 goats, but tried to return 6, plus a very fat sheep. You nearly choke on a fig. He thought no one would notice? Oh, he was clever, Idin Sin says. He even carved a fake goat symbol into the sheep's tag. But he didn't know we cross-reference height and hoof width. Wait, goat hoof dimensions? Yes, he replies smugly. Every decent receipt has specs, weight, horn condition, even temperament. One time we rejected a return because the goat had developed a mysterious twitch. He pauses, eyes twinkling. That goat later became a temple mascot. We named him Tishpak. You try not to laugh out loud. Somewhere in this dusty room, an actual clay record probably lists Tishpak's appointment as honorary goat in residence. It's then that you're invited to try scribing for yourself. Idin Sin gives you a soft piece of clay and a well-worn stylus. Let's say you're renting 4 goats from the temple for 12 days. They're going to be used for vineyard clearing. You'll return them by the second full moon in good condition. Ready? You stare at the blank clay. This is a test. With trembling hands, you press the symbols you remember. Goat pictograph, number marks, a sign for vineyard, the lunar return date. Idin Sin leans in occasionally, correcting your angle or suggesting a better wedge shape. It feels more like sculpting than writing. Slow, intentional, weirdly calming. Finally, he nods. Not terrible. You accidentally wrote mudfield instead of vineyard, but we've all been there. You ask what happens next. We'd dry the tablet, he explains. Then fire it, if the record's long-term, or store it with a soft cover if it's short-term. We have special shelves arranged by the temple sector. Goats, grain, oil, labor, land. It's all here. And it is. He waves his hand toward the room's outer wall, where rows of deep niches hold hundreds, maybe thousands of clay tablets. Some are crumbling at the edges. Others are still wrapped in dust cloth. All of them, you realize, are voices frozen in mud. It's humbling. Each tablet was once an anxious transaction, a worried herder, a tired scribe, a hope that things wouldn't go wrong. And somehow they survived. Later, as you walk the perimeter of the room, you notice a narrow alcove behind a half-curtained entryway. Inside, a single scribe sits alone, his back to the door, shaping a round tablet with almost ceremonial care. Idin Sin joins you silently. That's Kudur Mabuk, he whispers. He writes the divine debts. Divine? What? Vows, promises, rituals unfulfilled, he explains. When someone pledges a goat to the goddess and doesn't deliver, we log it. Not for punishment, just memory. You shiver slightly, even though the room is warm. As you prepare to leave, Idin Sin gifts you a small clay replica of a receipt, a training token. A souvenir, he says, and a reminder, never underestimate goats or scribes. You smile, bow slightly, and step outside into the brilliant light of mid-afternoon. Your eyes take a moment to adjust. After the cool shadows of the scribal hall, everything seems too bright, too loud, too present. But you feel different. Changed, even. You've held history in your hand, not just read it. Now you walk back toward the heart of the city, where temple towers cast long shadows across the dusty squares. You pass vendors and dancers, guards and children. No one notices the small clay tablet tucked under your arm. But you do. It's not just a souvenir, it's proof. Proof that every bleat, every hoofprint, every tiny, forgettable exchange matters. Because someone took the time to write it down. Babylon's storage wars, where receipts go to nap. By now, you've seen goats change hands, scribes etch clay like monks on a deadline, and temple accountants who could rival modern auditors. But there's one place you haven't explored yet, and it's strangely quiet. Too quiet, considering it holds the financial and spiritual guts of an entire civilization. You're standing in front of what looks like a squat mud brick ziggurat. Not a grand one like those that scrape the sky in honor of the gods, but a square frowning warehouse with heavy wooden doors and only one narrow window up top. Your guide today is Duri Shakin, a man whose job title translates loosely to Senior Keeper of the Things. His tunic is dusty, his hands are cracked from handling sun-baked clay, and his expression carries the serene despair of someone who files for a living and knows no one truly appreciates it. This, he says solemnly, swinging open the great door with a low creak, is where receipts come to sleep. You step inside, and at first it feels like a cool cave. The air smells of clay, straw, and something oddly metallic, maybe the ghost of ancient ink or the faint tang of preservation herbs. Rows upon rows of clay tablets stretch before you. Not scattered, not tossed. Arranged. Each row is a shelf, and each shelf is organized by type. Livestock loans, tax obligations, grain shares, marriage dowries, temple donations, and yes, entire aisles devoted to goat rentals. This way, Duri Shakin says, leading you toward a section marked with a hanging tag written in cuneiform symbols that translate to something like seasonal herding agreements. There's a rhythm to this place, soft echoes. Your sandals pad against packed earth. The shelves tower on either side like silent stone witnesses, and on each shelf, tablets rest with quiet dignity. One even has a dent shaped suspiciously like a goat hoof. These, Duri Shakin whispers, are not destroyed when the deal is done. Even when the goat is long dead, even when both herders have become ancestors, we keep the record. Because forgetting is dangerous. You raise an eyebrow. Dangerous how? He pauses beside a low shelf stacked with unusually thick tablets. He selects one and cradles it like a newborn chick. Then he turns it toward you. The tablet has both sides covered in dense text, framed by etched lines. It looks like a diary, but it's not. It's a layered rental agreement with annotations, disputes, even corrections, added years after the original was written. This one, Duri Shakin says, it's from when the Tigris flooded unexpectedly and wiped out 5 herds. Half the farmers claimed they had pre-flood goat loans. The others said the goats were only promised, not yet received. He taps the edge. This little wedge here, it's the arbitration seal. The priest-judge ruled that only contracts dated before the second barley harvest counted. Without that detail, the temple might have been ruined. You're stunned. That's the power of receipts. Clay could outlast floods. Historians still argue whether this tablet's date mark proves the earliest known example of retroactive insurance, he adds with a grin. But personally, I just think it's the first time someone shouted, "Check the timestamp." You move on. The next aisle is even stranger. Here, the tablets are stored in pairs, each main contract tucked alongside a witness tablet. What's that about, you ask? Duri Shakin looks pleased. You noticed? Double authentication. The main record goes to storage, the second, carried by the renter. If they match when returned, all good. If not, someone's trying to rewrite goat history. You run your fingers gently across one of the outer tablets. The clay has hardened into a warm, rough surface, and the symbols feel like pebbled braille. One mark, repeated at the end, seems familiar. Ah, Duri Shakin says, that's the scribe's mark. Like an artist's signature, every receipt is part of a chain. Renter, scribe, temple. Everyone leaves a fingerprint. It's oddly comforting. You realize that each tablet is a kind of social contract, a little clay handshake passed down through generations. But some of the shelves are different. Durishakin takes you to a small, locked room within the archive. He fumbles with a carved wooden key and opens the door slowly, revealing a collection of baked, blackened tablets. "These are the fire survivors," he says softly, "from the southern archives. During a raid by mountain tribes, the storage hall caught fire. Most tablets shattered, but a few, they baked hard enough to become almost like stone." He picks up one. "You see this mark? It's for 6 goats, too sickly. The deal was voided, but the record survived." You can barely believe it. A transaction that failed, preserved by accident because a building burned. Historians still argue whether this fire turned our whole understanding of Babylonian herding upside down, he says. Some say it proves temple goats were more plentiful than we thought. Others claim the number's a clerical error. I say it doesn't matter. He leans in, because it's still here. Your head is spinning. You'd expected to find some curious old receipts. Instead, you've stumbled into a living memory vault. Every herder, merchant, and meddling cousin who ever tried to sneak an extra goat is cataloged here. But there's one last oddity. In the far back corner, shielded by a lattice curtain and guarded by a surprisingly well-fed cat, there's a pedestal. Atop it sits a single round tablet encased in a carved wooden frame like a museum exhibit. Durishakin stops before it and bows slightly. "This," he says, "is the foundling record, oldest goat receipt ever found, we think." He gestures for you to step closer. The tablet is ancient, older than the city's outer walls. Its script is barely legible, but you can make out 3 symbols. A goat, a crude map, and what looks like a promise. The story goes, Durishakin says, that a wandering herder left his newborn goat with the temple while he went to war. He promised to return. He never did. The goat lived here for 9 years, eventually becoming part of the sacred herd. You blink. "That's oddly beautiful," he nods. "It reminds us what receipts are really for, not just money, but trust." You spend a few more minutes walking the aisles in quiet awe, a museum of mud, a library of lives. And when you finally step outside, blinking against the late afternoon sun, you feel as though you've exited a dream, one where everything, no matter how small, mattered enough to press into clay. Durishakin claps you on the back and hands you a small linen pouch. "Here," he says, "a replica of the foundling record, made by one of our apprentices. Let it remind you, every goat has a story." You laugh, tuck it into your tunic, and head down the path that leads back toward the river. Tomorrow, perhaps, you'll meet the goat traders who still whisper deals in the early morning mist. But tonight, you carry a whole civilization's memory in your hands. The whispering markets, where deals begin with a wink. By the time you reach the edge of the Babylonian marketplace, the sky has gone that soft, dusty lavender that only happens just before the desert cools. The sun has dropped behind the ziggurat, casting its long shadow like a sleepy giant over the streets. A breeze picks up, carrying the faint scent of figs, old wool, and firewood. Somewhere, a child laughs. Somewhere else, a goat responds indignantly. Welcome to the market, not the loud midday bazaar where sellers hawk fish and clay pots at top volume, but the early morning and twilight version. This is when the real deals happen. Quiet ones, soft ones, goat-scented ones. You round a corner and find yourself in a narrow lane lit by flickering oil lamps. Merchants hunch over wooden stalls. Scribes crouch inside niches with styluses ready. And in the center, like a bunch of gossiping aunts at a wedding, the goat traders gather. They don't yell. They don't wave signs. They murmur. They nod. They use more eyebrow movement than actual words. you'd think they were discussing poetry. One of them, a round-shouldered man with a long white beard and a belt made of twisted reeds, spots you and waves. "Are you here for goats or gossip?" he calls, his accent thick but friendly. You smile and answer, "Whichever is cheaper." He laughs, a wheezing, generous sound, and waves you over. "I'm Namtaru," he says, "and this is the Twilight Goat Pit. Come in, don't stand like a statue. We don't bite, though the goats might." You step closer and realize there are no visible animals here. Only contracts, styluses, and token stones carved with crude goat shapes. "What happened to the actual goats?" you ask. He grins. "Oh, they're real, just not here. You rent one now, you pick it up at dawn. Keeps the herders from losing sleep and the goats from eating each other's tails." He shows you a small clay token, no larger than a cookie. "This one's for a nanny goat, 2 years old, milk-bearing. Issued 3 moons ago, due for return next week. Want to rent it? I'll let it go cheap, because her bleat's annoying." You shake your head politely. You're here for the story, not livestock. Around you, others are doing business in a similar style. Some whisper numbers, others swap tokens. One man offers a fish in exchange for a half-week goat loan. A woman suggests a loaf of barley bread and an oath to return on the 3rd moonrise. It's commerce, but sleepier, slower, like farmers bartering in a dream. "So," you ask Namtaru, "do you ever get complicated deals? Like goats for weddings, or revenge goats?" He chuckles. "You'd be surprised. I once had a man rent a goat to sneak into his cousin's orchard and eat the sacred fig tree. Not his finest moment. He had to pay triple the price once the temple found out." You raise an eyebrow. "And the temple?" "Oh, the temple always gets involved," Namtaru says, shrugging. "They're like the referees. If you try to game the system, a scribe shows up at your door with a tablet and a raised eyebrow. You remember Duri Shakin's archive? Whole shelves dedicated to goat disputes, and nod. Historians still argue whether these goat markets were informal side hustles or semi-legal economies blessed by temple priests, Namtaru continues. But we say, if the scribes come sniffing, it's official enough. A young boy runs up and hands Namtaru a flat piece of clay. He reads it and sighs. "Ah, a cancellation. Poor little goat got sick. No rental after all." He pockets the tablet. "Sometimes I think the goats run this market, not us." As twilight deepens, you notice the market's rhythm shift again. Some traders begin packing up, sliding their clay tokens into pouches and sealing their contract satchels with string and wax. One man, tall, stoic, with a scar across his cheek, approaches Namtaru with a half-cracked token. "No," Namtaru says immediately. "This token's broken. You need to bring the matching half." The man frowns. "I lost it in the river." "That's what you said last month," Namtaru retorts, crossing his arms. "You want a goat? You bring full proof?" He turns to you and winks. "This is what we call the token tango. People think clay's unbreakable. It is not. You smile, then look closer at the tokens themselves. Each has a notch or groove like puzzle pieces. Some even have tiny cords threaded through them, tying them to matching contract tablets." "They match the contract?" you ask. "Exactly," says Namtaru. "2 halves, one with the renter, one with the record keeper. Bring both back? Great. Try to cheat with a fake goat. You'll be sleeping on temple steps." The system of paired proof, clay plus clay, suddenly strikes you as brilliantly low-tech. No passwords, no receipts in email spam folders, just a piece of earth that says, We made a deal, and we remember. Nearby, a woman is quietly negotiating the rental of 4 goats for her niece's marriage procession. Only the prettiest ones, she insists. No patchy coats. The seller raises an eyebrow. I rent goats, not fashion models. They haggle for a bit, then seal the agreement with a nod, and the woman gently presses her fingernail into the wet clay of a new receipt before walking away. A mark of identity. You turn to Namtaru. Do you ever lose track of goats? All the time, he says cheerfully. But not for long. Goats are like gossip. They wander, but they always circle back. He points to a nearby scribe, sitting cross-legged on a reed mat. That's Ninosh Zida, best memory in the market. He once traced a missing goat from the city outskirts to a boat in Uruk, just by comparing tablet handwriting. Historians still argue whether Ninosh Zida's sleuthing was intuition or early criminal profiling, Namtaru adds. I say he's part bloodhound. You thank Namtaru for the tour, and as you prepare to leave the market, you take one last look around. There's no shouting, no flurry of coins, just tokens passed quietly, jokes shared softly, and goats arranged like dowries or dreams. It's slower capitalism, an economy built on trust, talk, and terracotta. And as night finally settles over the market, you can almost believe that business, too, can be gentle. Before you leave, Namtaru presses a spare token into your palm. No goat attached, he says with a smirk. Just a souvenir. Proof you were here. You turn it over and find a tiny goat etched on the underside, sleepy-eyed and smirking. That night, you'll sleep with it under your pillow, just in case. Sealed with a thumbprint. How goat receipts outlived their goats. The sun hasn't risen yet, but the horizon is thinking about it. That inky blue of pre-dawn is softening into a shy lavender, and somewhere nearby, a rooster crows, like he's the first bird who's ever had an opinion. You stretch your arms, shake the dust from your tunic, or maybe just your imagination, and feel that peculiar peace that only ancient cities can give you before the crowds wake up. You're still in Babylon, and you're not done yet. Today, you're going to witness what happens to a goat receipt after the goat has been returned, chewed up someone's robe, and been firmly handed back to its owner with minimal ceremony. Because Babylon wasn't just about lending and borrowing. It was about remembering that you did. You walk through the outer district where the ziggurat looms in the distance and the city's sleeping breath hums through alleys like an invisible tide. A row of clay tablets sits neatly on a wooden table, still warm from being fired in yesterday's kiln. They bear tiny impressions, rows of cuneiform, stylus marks that dance like river reeds in the mud. At the edge of the table, you spot it, a receipt for a goat rental, now expired. It's been returned. The goat is safe, possibly chewing cud somewhere, and now the tablet must face its fate. A young scribe, barely more than 15 and with ink-stained fingers, approaches with the air of someone about to perform a ritual. This one? He asks, showing you a tablet. Returned on time, no damage. It smelled a bit, but no fines. He gently presses his own seal next to the borrower's mark, a stamp of finality. Then he walks the tablet across the courtyard to a tall, dusty structure filled with rows and rows of clay shelves. This is the archive. No, not the grand one filled with royal edicts and temple hymns. This one's more humble. The Goat Archive. Technically called the House of Animal Transactions, but everyone just calls it the Clay Zoo. Here, thousands of tablets sleep in dusty silence. Some are small, others chipped, many barely legible after centuries. And all of them carry the whispered history of goats that were loaned, returned, lost, or accidentally married into someone's family. The boy gently slides the new tablet into a slot marked with the current moon cycle. "That's it," he says. "Now it lives here forever, or until someone drops it." And that's the thing. Historians still argue whether these archives were meant as permanent storage or temporary proof. Some tablets, like royal decrees, were deliberately baked hard to last for generations. Others, like market receipts, might have been left unfired, just sun-dried and destroyed when their purpose was done. But not always, especially not in Babylon, where bureaucracy was a lifestyle. You bend down to examine the older shelves. One tablet catches your eye, dated to the reign of Hammurabi himself. It details the rental of 4 goats to a merchant's son, with a penalty clause if they eat anyone's sandals. The borrower signed with a thumbprint. His mark is still visible centuries later. This is where the goat story becomes something stranger. These receipts didn't just help people remember, they helped cities function. In a society where writing wasn't universal and oral memory could be fuzzy after a few too many cups of date wine, clay tablets offered accountability. You couldn't argue with a baked brick. You meet a record keeper named Taram Kubi. She's got wrinkles like canyon walls and a voice like old papyrus. She walks you through her ledgers, or rather tablet boxes. We catalog by moon, by scribe, and by number of goats, also by odor, if especially memorable, she says, deadpan. You ask how long she's been doing this. Since the goats were fashionable, she says. Taram Kubi explains how receipts were often written in triplicate, one for the lender, one for the borrower, one for the archive. If there's a dispute, we cross-check, she says. Sometimes people try to forge a receipt, but if the scribe has good handwriting, we can always tell. Forgery wasn't easy in clay. The styluses left distinct impressions. Every scribe had a rhythm, a kind of signature flourish in their wedge marks. Some even had personal stamps. You hold one of the older tablets and marvel at its texture. Smooth but gritty. The language flows in precise angles, telling a story more vivid than any photograph. Who borrowed what, when, for how long, and what happened if the goat got, let's say, misplaced. Here's one, says Taram Kubi, lifting a heavy slab of clay. Goat borrowed for a temple ceremony, never returned. The borrower claimed it ascended to heaven. You raise an eyebrow. The temple fined him 3 jars of beer, she shrugs. There's something strangely moving about this, the thought that a goat rental could be so meticulously recorded, that someone's fleeting errand became a lasting inscription, that somewhere in the belly of Babylon, a tiny drama played out in hoofprints and stylus strokes. And it wasn't just goats. The more you dig, figuratively and literally, the more receipts you find for oxen, sheep, even bees. Babylonian tablets record leases for donkeys, contracts for grain, and one curious note involving a rented monkey for entertainment purposes. Historians still argue whether it was a trained performer or just a terrible idea. As you move deeper into the archive, a larger truth emerges. These receipts weren't just about animals or items. They were about systems, about order, about accountability in a world without folders, computers, or even paper. They were memories carved in mud. And what's more, they worked. Babylon thrived for centuries, not just because of its walls or priests or brilliant astronomers, but because of its scribes, quietly scratching goat deals into slabs, keeping track of who owed what, who borrowed it, who paid, who cheated and got caught. It's a bureaucracy so slow it feels like a lullaby. You stand in the clay zoo a little longer. watching as the scribes start their morning work. One is reading a tablet aloud. Another is blowing dust off an old receipt like it's a delicate flower. A third is arguing with someone over whether a goat described as tan was more honey beige or burnt umber. Outside, the city stirs, the market yawns, goats start bleating. Life goes on, and here in the quiet shelves of the archive, the goats, past and present, are remembered. You run your fingers over one more tablet before you leave. It's unremarkable. One goat, 2 days old, returned with a limp. But it's real. Someone cared enough to record it. Someone thought it mattered. And maybe that's what Babylon teaches you, not just about receipts or goats or clever scribe systems, but about memory itself. Every ordinary thing was worth keeping track of. Even a goat named Pushtag. The last echoes of the goat pens drift off into silence. The scribes have packed away their styluses, the clay has cooled, and even the roosters have stopped bragging about sunrise. You step softly out of the clay zoo, leaving the little shelves behind, each one still holding its quiet story. The streets of Babylon are softer now, shadows stretched and quiet. You walk slowly through the waking city, past the market stalls being swept clean, past the temple gates still closed for a few more minutes of stillness. You pass a child chasing a goat that clearly doesn't want to be chased. Some things never change. Your feet move gently across stone paths worn smooth by centuries, and your breath falls into rhythm with the hush of this ancient place. The noise, the dust, the drama, they're far away now. What stays with you is something else. The soft permanence of a thumbprint pressed into clay. The patience of people who believed even borrowed goats were worth remembering. Maybe you feel a little different now, a bit slower, a little more tuned into the beauty of the small stuff, the everyday things that mattered enough for someone to carve them into history. The stars are still out. The sky hasn't fully decided what kind of day it wants to be. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the feel of warm clay in your hands, the scent of goats in the air, and the sound of quiet scribes doing their humble, necessary work. The moment stretches, then fades. There's nothing more to do now. Just breathe. Let your thoughts soften. Let your shoulders fall. You've wandered far enough tonight. The receipts are written. The goats are home, and so are you.